reflect the standards of elegance and sophistication that was once expected of soirees in my day. But times being what they are, you'll do it. I am your host, Ogden. No, I do not believe I need to tell you who I am, because good people of intelligence such as yourselves surely know mine. Oh. This will not do. This will not do. I mean to say, how can you tune a soiree and not know your host? Besides, knowing a little bit about me will help you better understand the other characters you'll meet outside tonight. So pay attention. My name is Ogden Livingston Mills, and I was born in 1884 to Ogden and Ruth Mills, who were very rich and very famous. Famous mostly for being rich. And for their legendary parties. Why, there was a time when an invitation to a Mills Mansion soiree was the envy of all high society. Or even today, nearly 100 years after their deaths, their house is a state park and stands as testament to the splendor and the excess of the Gilded Age. Perhaps you want to go visit there someday. It's just a couple of miles down the road in Statsburg. And while you're there, perhaps you'll play a little round of golf at the Dinsmore Golf Course, which naturally was our family's private golf course. Now, unlike my parents, who were socialites to the bone, I chose a more civic-minded path in life. Oh, sure, after graduating from Harvard in 1904, I did go into business for a while. But in 1914, I followed my dream, surely every young man's dream, and won a seat in the New York State Senate. That very year, however, war broke out all across Europe. The Great War, they called it, though I found nothing great about it. But then, in 1917, the United States entered that war. And well, I could hardly shirk my duty, noblesse oblige and all that. So, and it was a sacrifice, I offered up my 120-room estate in Paris to General John Pershing for his headquarters. It was the least I could do. Actually, I did a bit more than that. You see, I resigned my seat in the Senate and joined the U.S. Expeditionary Forces as a captain in the Army. Oh, I had grand adventures because, you see, I was an aviator. Dashing, no? As dashing as it was, however, it was a serious job. I flew reconnaissance missions over enemy lines in an airplane covered with cloth. Very dangerous, but very exciting. And if you don't believe me, just ask Gerald Morgan. When you meet him later on this evening, he once wrote for the newspaper that the true romance of war was found in the skies. Now, there was nothing romantic about it for those poor sods down on the ground. They fought a miserable war in the trenches, and they died miserable deaths, as often from disease as from injury. Young William White will want to tell you about that when you meet him. Fortunately for our troops, the Red Cross stood ready to serve with their heroic nurses who served and cared for the sick, the injured, and the dying. Ask Ruth Morgan about that when you meet her. Oh, and you'll meet others tonight, too. You'll meet Griswold Webb. You'll meet Les Entry and his wife Marge. And they all have a tale to tell. But no matter who you speak to, we all did our bits in that nasty war. Hard to believe it's been 100 years. Many of us, perhaps most of us, came back changed from the war, even though we had been in it only a year. I myself was divorced shortly after my return. Happened to a lot of us. Perhaps that's why so many chose not to dwell on their war experiences when they returned. I can tell you that's one reason why I jumped right back into politics after my return. Well, that. And because I was so angry at members of Congress. I know it's hard to believe being angry at Congress, but it was fully justified. Because some in Congress insisted on giving away the Treasury's funds in the form of war bonuses. I mean to say, can you imagine giving extra money to soldiers simply for fighting in a war? I didn't need it. Why should they? So I got myself elected to the House of Representatives. And there I stayed until 1927 when I was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, where I belong. And there I stayed until good old Herbert Hoover named me Secretary of the Treasury, a full cabinet position. Now, there isn't really much more you need to know about me, and it doesn't really matter because I didn't live a lot longer anyway. You see, in 1937, at the ripe old age of 53, I dropped dead of a heart attack and rest here eternally. Perhaps you want to look and see if you can find my humble and modest resting place. But what you'll really want to do, and what's truly important to know, is that during the Great War, at the time of that war, this church was already more than 100 years old. It was founded in 1811 by the likes of Dr. Samuel Bard, who was the personal physician of George Washington, and the founder of New York Hospital, and the founder of the New York School of Medicine, first in the state. Sadly, his reputation is somewhat sullied by his participation in that abomination known as slavery, which is to say he owned slaves, as did many of New York's elite in those bad old days. Days, I'm happy to say, that are behind us. Nevertheless, over this church's 200 years, many of its parishioners have served both God and country quite faithfully. Why, did you know that during the Great War, one of our parishioners was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy? You may have heard of him. Franklin something. Delano. Yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who regrettably went on to become the 32nd President of the United States, and even more regrettably, was the man who kicked me out of my position as Secretary of the Treasury. So we won't speak about him anymore tonight, will we? What we will speak of is your tour guides. They are your best friends to meet. Follow them faithfully. Do as they say. Keep alert. Watch your step, and you'll come through safe and sound. Now, there are lanterns outside for you to light your way. Or if you prefer, you may use your own flashlights, or as we called them in my day, torches. But whatever you do tonight, stay together. You are all family tonight. And if you do as I say, I assure you, you will have a most memorable evening indeed. And with that, my friends, I bid you good night.
Well, bonsoir. Sorry, I mean good evening. Sometimes I forget I'm not in Paris anymore. But allow me to introduce myself. Enchanté. Private First Class William T. White. I was born right up the road from here in Statsburg on the 19th of July, 1896. My father, Samuel White, was a well-respected plumber, and my mother Ada, well, she was a loving mama. I was happy growing up in this little town, but I wanted something more out of life, some adventure, you know? So I didn't want to spend my time sitting down, inspecting people's, well, you know, plumbing. That's one word for it. So you can only imagine how excited a young guy like me got when the news of a grand war breaking out in Europe came to our ears. I was 18, but I'd have to wait a whole while before we finally got involved in that. I'd get my chance in early June of 1917. I went right down to Poughkeepsie and signed right up. In fact, I had volunteered so early that I was placed in the 1st Division's 1st Field Artillery. Ain't that something? So, we were then sent off to Sparta, Wisconsin for basic training at Camp Robinson. The work was grueling, but it only made the food a lot better. So, we were then sent back here to New York, where we boarded the USS Mount Vernon. Now, that might not sound like much to you, but we had heard that before the ship was being used by our Navy, it was a seized Hun ocean liner, which we had captured once we declared war. So you can only imagine how that made us feel. Finally, we made it to France by early November, and things were surprisingly quiet given the circumstances of a war going on. And I had plenty of time to immerse myself in some French culture. And it would be a whole 7 months before we got involved in our first battle at Cantigny. That was our chance to show all of Europe that us Americans weren't just here to sit around. We were here to do business. So, with liberty on our side, and a new exciting weapon called the tank. God, I love the tank. We managed to take the town in less than a half hour. And we did. I, myself, had fired so many artillery shells that they stacked this tall, and you can't really tell how tall that is because I'm only 5'5", but still. Get a taller person in here and they'll show you how tall those things stacked up. But the victory would be short-lived, however, as the Hun would make their biggest offensive yet that spring and push us all the way to Paris. We knew then that victory depended on us doughboys, as the Europeans called us. So we devised a plan of our own. That summer, we'd push the Hun back, take the land that they took from us in the spring, and maybe even win the war. So that summer we did, and victories came to us, but slowly and gruelingly. It took everything we had that summer to flush out the Germans, including gas and flames, nasty stuff. And we succeeded, though. We managed to push them all the way back to Meuse-Argonne, and during that battle is when I took ill. I developed a very deep cough that shook even the men around me, and with artillery fire going on, you can only imagine. I was sent on October 10th to Field Hospital number 12, and then the next day, October 11th, I was sent to Field Hospital 163, which tells you just how many hospitals were needed for that offensive. But it wouldn't be too much longer. October 14th, 1918. I died in that tent, less than a month before the end of the war. Even sadder than that, as we were sending our guys over there, that sickness, that Spanish influenza as they called it back then, made its way back here, killing lots more than just I. I was then buried in Chappy, France, 15 miles from where I died, and 15 miles from Verdun. And that's where I stayed, until in 1921, my family was finally able to bring me home, and lay me to rest here at St. James. And here is where my adventure ended. Some might say that was a dark adventure, and I'd be inclined to agree with you. But if it wasn't for sacrifices made just like mine, then maybe the war may have not ended by 1918. It may have not even ended at all. And nowadays, I find plumbing is all it's cracked up to be compared to war. So, thank you all for your time, and don't freeze. Au revoir.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Senator John Griswold Webb. I prefer to be called Griswold. You may not have heard of me, but I'm about to change that. I was what some people might call a modern-day Renaissance man. Farmer, politician, war correspondent, soldier, adventurer, husband, and father. I did it all. Sadly, I was cut down in the prime of my life, dying of emphysema at my Hyde Park home in 1934 at the age of 43. But had I lived to be 100, my life could not have been fuller, and I'm anxious to tell you my story. I was born in 1890 into what you might call the lap of luxury. My father was railroad magnate H. Walter Webb, and my mother was Layla Griswold, a socialite. Father died when I was 10, and when I was 14, mother married Ogden Codman Jr., the famous society architect and interior designer. This was not exactly in my best interest, because when mother died in 1910, she left him her fortune. That was when I decided to leave New York at my earliest opportunity and never look back. My first adventure came in the summer of 1912. A Harvard classmate and I decided to do a cross-country trip by automobile from New York to Vancouver to study geology and biology. Cross-country trips were all the rage, the automobile still being new. But what made this trip so newsworthy, even making the New York Times, was that virtually nobody had traveled this northern route before. There were no major highways back then, and most roads were rough and zigzagging. We chose a light vehicle, a 30-horsepower Benz of the latest model, and we equipped ourselves with ropes, spades, and other things we felt we needed to make it through the mountain passes. Needless to say, we were also well armed, if you know what I mean. Although I was a member of the Automobile Club of America, we still had to bring along spare parts and do our own repairs when we broke down out in the middle of nowhere. Here's where the car manual was a lifesaver. But we never had to worry about getting lost. We used the GPS of its day, the official Automobile Blue Book, which provided step-by-step directions between landmarks along our route. After 3 grueling months, we finally made it safely to Vancouver. I had no intention of going back home just yet. Instead, I took some time off from my studies and went to Mexico as a war correspondent, covering the Mexican Revolution for the Boston Herald. I campaigned with General Huerta, who was backed by the United States government against the revolutionary forces of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. Now, I expected I would be afforded the protection usually reserved for war correspondents. Instead, picture if you can, a young man in civilian clothes, yours truly, lying prone and furiously taking notes as artillery shells from both sides exploded all around me. It was perhaps a little too much excitement, even for me. Still, I stuck it out for about 8 months, then I called it quits and finally came home. I finished up at Harvard and then went on to Cornell University College of Agriculture. After graduating from there in 1915, I started Webb Farms in Clinton Corners, raising prized Guernseys. Somehow, in the space of a couple of years, and much to my surprise, I had settled down to the life of a gentleman farmer. How did it happen, you ask? Well, as things often do, it all started with a woman. I met the lovely Anne Pendleton Rogers, the daughter of Colonel Archibald Rogers of Hyde Park, and before I knew it, the rest of my life was all planned out. Colonel Rogers took a keen interest in my future and encouraged me to go into farming. I don't recall having any say in the matter. In 1914, Anne and I married, right here, at St. James Church, in fact. And then she insisted on taking agricultural classes with me at Cornell. Her support meant a lot to me. 2 years later, we welcomed a son into the world, and then a daughter. In due course, I even became a vestryman here at St. James. My days as an adventurer seemed to be over, yet my life felt complete. Then came the Great War, or what you nowadays call World War I. I started out working for the war effort on the home front, but I got restless and enlisted in the Army. I took field artillery officers training and was stationed with the U.S. Field Artillery at Camp Zachary Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky. I was now a bona fide soldier, but I never made it overseas. That was a big disappointment for me. My maternal grandfather was a U.S. congressman, so it seems only natural that I would eventually enter politics. I became a New York State Assemblyman in 1919, and in 1923, I became a member of the New York State Senate, where I remained until my death. I'm proud of my record in the state legislature. A Republican, I got along well with our Democratic governor, Franklin Roosevelt. After all, he and my wife's families were neighbors here in Hyde Park. And perhaps even more importantly, we were both Harvard men. One of my most noteworthy achievements was introducing the idea for the Mid-Hudson Bridge. Perhaps, had I lived longer, I would have gone on to higher political aspirations. As a senator, I was considered a great friend to our state's military forces, the New York National Guard, and the Naval Militia. I pushed for veterans' rights, and I was a pioneer in the field of aviation regulation. I was also instrumental in the formation of the American Legion here in Dutchess County. You've heard stories this evening from some of the brave Americans who served our country during the Great War. Rich and poor, soldier and volunteer, we all answered the call. One soldier never came home. Please remember to thank a veteran the next time you see one. Thank you, and good night.
Come along now. Some of us have graves to spend the night in.
We can come in a little closer. We can come in a little closer.
Are we all organized? Yes? Come on.
Yes.
Speak up, my dears. Are you not my Red Cross nurse volunteers?
Oh, yes, we are.
You don't look like them. Well, never mind. It matters not. I have always been very good at organization. That's a specialty of mine. Oh, but where was I? Oh, yes. I'm buried right here. My name is Ruth Morgan, and I'm a descendant of every prominent family from the Northeast, including 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. But that is not enough for a Morgan girl. Now, my mother, Angelica, you met her sister here last year, Gertrude Livingston Lowndes, you remember. Well, my mother taught her girls to be more than ornaments of society. Now, it's true, when I was born in 1870, Queen Victoria was a force to be reckoned with, and the Gilded Age was the reality of the Newport and New York of my youth, but Morgan girls need to right the wrongs of the society that we lived in. Now, our townhouse was in Washington Square in New York. Beautiful. And we have a lovely mansion in Statsburg called Stonehurst, sadly gone now. I went to St. Margaret's Church, but there's no graveyard up there. So, here I am. I say I'm amongst very fine people, don't you? Although some of them are awfully noisy. Now, you try righting the wrongs of society while changing your clothes 6 times a day. Now, I have to say, my sister Margaret did quite well for herself. She was a suffragist, like myself. And Geraldine, the baby sister of the family, she became First Lady of New Jersey. And she was instrumental in introducing reform of prisons and the care of the mentally ill. She also became very good friends with, what's her name? Eleanor Roosevelt. Yes. But I chose another path. You see, my mother, she worked in a Bellevue Hospital. Bellevue Hospital is not far from our townhouse in Washington Square. She worked in the School of Nursing, so I followed in my mother's footsteps. And I also followed her into the Social Services Department, which she established. You'll be amazed at the need for social services in the Lower East Side. So many horrid living conditions, working conditions. This resulted in illness. But I have to say, it is my work during the Great War that would write the script for the remainder of my days, and the work that I am most proud of. Now, we did not enter that war until 1917. It took us a long time. And we finally got over there in 1918. And I, being the only female member of the Finance Committee of the American Red Cross, that and my knowledge of French language and culture, they sent me over there. You would have thought that we had learned nothing from Florence Nightingale and the Crimean. The nurses' services hit one obstacle after the next, a big bloody mess. They were not under the control of the army. The surgeons were constantly getting their trousers in a twist. Big surprise there. And somebody had to run the entire affair. Yours truly steps up. Now, I have to say, Julia Stimpson was in charge of the nurses. Brilliant woman. And they did have 50 portable hospital units, what you call MASH units today. But they needed someone with administrative finesse to run the show. Now, there was a great deal of controversy having me, a layperson, in charge of the nurses. And I felt bad about it for about a second. And then I got to work. The next time someone complains to you about modern technology, you just remind them of my modern technology. So many lost letters, mixed messages, letters arriving on the desks of doctors after they had gone home. That's helpful. Yes, non-stop mayhem. But it's the horrors that these nurses encountered that would leave them permanently scarred in the mind as well as the body. So, after the war, I helped form the committee. I was the chair of the Committee for the International Cooperation for the Prevention of War. I also served on the League of Women Voters, naturally, and I served on the Committee for the Causes and Cures of War. I know the titles are cumbersome, but the work was in earnest. I am glad, though, that I followed my mother to this spot in 1934. I died. Big disappointment, I know. But I did not have to see the Second World War. The second! So much for my Committee for the Causes and Cure of War. But my legacy, such as it is, was the smooth operating services of those nurses during the Great War and the continued vitality of the Social Services Department in the hospitals to this day. Not a bad legacy for somebody who had to learn how to curtsy and change their clothes 6 times a day. I do say so myself. Anyway, enough about me. Au revoir! Godspeed! Go pester my brother!
Oh boy, more people. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. We never really know how many people to expect back here. Mrs. Entrup? Marge, dear? We got company.
More people? Les, it's a good thing we learned how to handle all these hordes of people over the years, right, dear?
Yes, dear.
I mean, we had to learn how to handle lots of people at a moment's notice, haven't we?
Yes, dear, lots of people.
We'd have to make all kinds of food and a whole bunch of it in a hurry when it came to working for Mrs. Roosevelt.
Yes, lots of food. But nothing too fancy.
And thank God for that. When my husband Les first came to inform me that Mrs. Roosevelt wanted us to cook for her on a full-time basis, I immediately did not like the idea. What did I tell you, Les?
Well, you said if she wanted you to make anything fancy like pheasant under glass, you'd most likely say goodbye to her as quick as you said hello.
That's right. I don't do fancy. You want a meatloaf? I can make you a meatloaf. You want chili? I make the best darn chili you ever tasted. But pheasant under glass? What if the First Lady of the United States wanted you to come cook for her? Would you feel up to the task?
But I reassured my wife the Roosevelts were not known for their culinary pleasures. The president himself preferred a good hot dog to anything fancier. And besides, it's not like we were working at the White House. Though I had been Republican chairman in New Jersey, so I didn't think she wanted us there either. Charlie Kernan, the Roosevelt groundskeeper, asked me if I wanted to help him get the cottage at Valkill ready for the Memorial Day weekend. And I thought, well, it was that 1956. I could use a little sunshine, fresh air. Why not do a little outdoor work?
Now, Les had never worked outdoors much before. We were always the kind of people to work inside, like in a kitchen. We owned a bar just down the street from here.
Anyway, I worked for a few weeks raking leaves and trimming hedges, and we had the place looking pretty good. And that's when Charlie asked me if me and Marge here would want to be part of the cooking team for the Memorial Day picnic.
We had no idea what was coming our way.
We learned they could be crazy times, but they were good times.
Oh, she'd really put me up a tree sometimes. We'd start out the day with Mrs. Roosevelt saying we had 8 people coming for dinner. And then she'd go about her day inviting people she spoke with over the phone or ran into at the post office. Next thing you know, 20 people walk in the door.
Our first night on the job, I had to cut the roast so thin you could see through it.
And I will never forget when Nikita Khrushchev came through. At least we had proper warning of the number of people coming, but we were also informed that Mr. Khrushchev wanted no American food.
Mrs. R said we had to make something Russian.
All I knew how to make was borscht. So we made enough to feed about 40 people. Guess who never touched the stuff? That's right. He simply picked up one of my dinner rolls off the table and ran out the door.
The boys from the press took a picture of him holding up that roll with a headline that said, "One for the road."
Guess what we had for dinner every night for a week?
Oh, Lord, did we ever.
Oh, Mrs. Roosevelt turned to us for guidance on how to put together a large and pleasing meal. Quickly, we got it down to a science, and very soon we felt right at home.
See, we were not the help or the servants. We were part of the family.
She always said, people work best when they work with you, not for you. That's how it was for us. It really has been a blessing in this life. And look how far we've come.
Marge and I are originally from New Jersey. When I was a young man, I served in the First World War. I was in the cavalry, which was on its way out with all the modern tanks and automobiles. I was in the trenches. I was gassed. On top of that, I got scabies, which is horrid stuff. But it sent me home. I was lucky to get home. I'm sure I don't need to tell you the cost of that war based on some of the people you'll meet here tonight. Anyway, I come from a fairly well-off family, so I received decent care on my return.
My family were poor farmers in New Jersey. We didn't have much money at all. And I can recall that your mother didn't like it when we got together.
It's probably worth me telling you that I come from a German Lutheran background, and Marge here is Irish Catholic. I saw her for the first time decorating one of those windows in a fancy New York department store. To come to think of it, I don't even remember what store it was. I just knew I had to have the girl in the window. My parents disowned me when I married her.
After we married, we came up to Arlington, where I worked at the Howard Johnson on Route 44, and Les worked in an electrical factory. And we were so blessed with 3 children.
After we started working full-time for Mrs. Roosevelt, she asked us to move into Valkill so we could all be together. Our kids grew up with Roosevelt grandchildren.
She even paid for one of our daughters to go off to nursing school. We begged her not to make a big deal of it, but she said she regularly sent checks to people she didn't even know. And she considered it a joy to help people she cared for. That shows you how amazing she was. And when she died in '62, we mourned like we'd lost one of our own.
I was a pallbearer at Mrs. Roosevelt's funeral. It was a hard day for everyone, and everyone was there. President Kennedy, Truman, Eisenhower, and the man who would be President Johnson was there too.
We went down to Florida and worked for her son Elliot, who was mayor of Miami Beach at the time. But it was nothing like working for Mrs. Roosevelt, where we were happy and loved, and we moved back up here within a year.
We knew Hyde Park was home, so it made sense for me to go to St. James. I joined a church, and I'd go on Sundays with Mrs. Roosevelt, after which I would go to the grocery market with orders from Mrs. Entrim.
Les is being too modest. He sang with the choir here, you know, and he has a voice like an angel. Sing us your favorite song, Les, my love.
Ave Maria, gratia plena.
Have a lovely night, folks.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm William Gerald Dare Morgan. That is a mouthful, I know, and I always prefer simply Gerald. I know some of you are thinking, Morgan, isn't that a bank? J.P. Morgan, a bank on Wall Street. There's no bank on Wall Street named for me. We were in the shipping business, although our shipping did not include spiced rum. I was born in Stassburg, 1879, the youngest of 4 children and the only boy. I was rather glad to follow in father's footsteps and attend Yale, where I graduated in the class of 1901. But what to do with myself? Financially secure? I fancied being a newspaper correspondent. I had read the thrilling accounts of the Spanish-American and Boer Wars written by Richard Harding Davis, the famous correspondent of our day, and I said, that's the life for me. I guess love of adventure passed from grandfather to father to me, even though I'm not a sailor. Well, I worked my way into the business, and luck would have it, I worked with Davis, covering the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and the Veracruz affair which followed it. We became fast friends. It was quite an education, I can tell you, more practical than Yale ever was. I even managed in 1907 to take a trip up the Orinoco River in South America. That all changed in 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. War soon followed, as you know, and I yearned to return to the life of a war correspondent. Well, again the fates were kind, and Davis and I set sail on the Lusitania, August 4th of 1914. I dare say, had we tried that in May of 1915, I wouldn't be here, I'd be at the bottom of the Irish Sea. When we got to London, things there were different too. Before war correspondents had been welcomed, now we were pariahs, denied credentials by England, France, and Belgium, mistrusted, accused of being spies. Now, it's hard to write a good story if you can't get the facts. Well, this failed to deter us. We made our way to the continent and hired a motor car. And Davis always said that for me, a map was an open book, so I became a navigator as he drove around Belgium looking for armies. However, given our precarious situation, we carried the flags of England, France, Belgium, and Russia, just in case. As he found an army, we rang up its flag. And then the process began. Arrest, interrogation. Oh, by the way, you're Americans. Have the Americans joined the Allied side? Davis was faster on his feet than I always was, and my ribs were sore from the prodding he gave me before I could say yes without batting an eye. Indeed, even after lengthy conversations with the French, they threw us in jail for 3 days, rescued by our consul. Went out again, and this time when we were stopped, I went back to Brussels. Richard went on, arrested by the Germans, almost shot as a spy. He came back to Brussels, and of course, went out again, this time by train. When we reached Louvain, the Germans would not let us off the train. We could smell smoke and see a glare. When allowed to disembark, we could see what the Hun had done. Now, we had seen brutality in war, but this was beyond all measure. War waged against civilian men, women, and children. Under the pretext of retaliating for the shooting of a staff officer, they decided to destroy the city, burning its university, its churches, its libraries, centuries old. They marched women and children off to be sent to concentration camps, herded the men together, and shot over 600 of those. From this event, we began calling the Germans the Hun. And this war changed other ways too. No longer a romantic war of individual combat. It was a remote war, waged by men in London, Paris, Brussels, and Berlin. The men on the field were really players on a board, much like young William over there. When we came back to the States, things changed for me. A romance bloomed between me and Mary Newbold, daughter of a state senator and neighbor to the Roosevelts. Indeed, Mary and Franklin had been childhood playmates. We were engaged March of 1916 and married in June. This lovely period in my life was only marred by the death of my dear friend Davis. His heart gave out in April of 1916. And there was not much time for married bliss, as they say. In April of 1917, when America entered the Great War, I wanted to do my bit, as we said back then. And in September of 1917, I was sent over there. In honor of the centennial of this war ending, I'm in uniform for you today. Private purchase, non-regulation, tailored in Savile Row, London. I trained in the field artillery, but my job was in the press division. You see, I had become a chief field censor on Pershing's staff, Imagine that. A war correspondent. One used to complaining about and circumventing rules, now a censor in charge of basically enforcing them. You might call me a fox in the henhouse, as it were. My colleagues were happy to see me there. Why? I'd been in their shoes but a short time before. I tried to do what I could, but I was challenged by two things. The need for requirements of public free press and the need for security for the military. So I gave them routines and itineraries from which they could not deviate. But I gave them very detailed briefings with a warning they could not publish their stories until I approved them. This way, the free press was maintained and I kept the central powers from finding out about troop movements. Good example. Fred Ferguson was a friend of mine and he wanted a scoop. And I said, yes, for old time's sake. Fred wrote these 50-word news flashes. You might call them tweets nowadays. I held them up and censored them until his writings matched the briefings I had given him. This way, he got the scoop and the public got the news. Well, the war ended in November of 1918 and I came home in 1919. But what to do? I had spent the last 4 years of my life in Europe. Retire? Lead a life of leisure? No, sir. You know, my sister was involved in social causes. I was my own way. I wrote a book, published in 1922, The Public Relief of Sickness. Ironically, in my book, I advocated for the mandatory contributions for health insurance and the building of public medical facilities so all would receive health care. I wonder how that turned out. Well, it was not all work and no play. When Mary inherited Bellafield from her father, we became the Roosevelt's neighbors. Spent many weekends and evenings with them, became quite close. Indeed, when Franklin was elected president, he asked me to be on the Social Security Board. Imagine that. A Yale man in a Harvard administration. Well, we even stayed overnight at the White House on one occasion. But you know, I am prattling on. The evening draws to a close. All things must come to an end, and mine came in 1948. I've been here ever since. I have lots more I could tell you, but you have places to go. It's a long way to Tipperary for you, so until that time, pack up your troubles, your old kit bag, and smile, 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 and keep the home fires burning. Good night.